We often look to the past to understand ourselves. Tonight, we turn our attention to the year 1894 and the solemn story of Benjamin Pitezel and his children. It's a case that reminds us that behind historical records are real people whose lives were irrevocably changed by the events that transpired. This is their story, as best it can be told. During the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a city of marvels and shadows, two men solidified a fateful partnership. One was Benjamin Pitezel, a carpenter with a wife and 5 children, a man known to have a weakness for alcohol and a history of small-time schemes. The other was his employer, a man of immense charisma and chilling duplicity, known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. Holmes was the architect of the infamous building that the press would later dub the Murder Castle, a labyrinth of secret passages, windowless rooms, and trapdoors. To Pitezel, Holmes was a brilliant and resourceful entrepreneur. He saw him as a ticket to a better life, a man who could conjure wealth seemingly out of thin air. For years, Pitezel had served as Holmes's loyal right-hand man, a trusted associate in various legitimate and fraudulent enterprises. This loyalty, born of misplaced trust, would lead Pitezel and his family down a path of unimaginable horror. By 1894, with creditors closing in after the end of the World's Fair, H. Holmes needed money, and he devised his most audacious plan yet. The scheme was a classic insurance fraud, but with a characteristically macabre twist. He convinced his devoted associate Benjamin Pitezel to be his partner. The plan, as Holmes laid it out, was simple. Pitezel would take out a $10,000 life insurance policy on himself from the Fidelity Mutual Life Association. Then he would travel to Philadelphia, where he would establish a new identity as an inventor named B.F. Perry. The crucial part of the scheme was to fake Pitezel's death. Holmes assured Pitezel that he would procure a substitute cadaver from a New York medical supplier. They would then disfigure the corpse to make it unidentifiable, stage a lab explosion to account for the death of B.F. Perry, and have Holmes, along with an unsuspecting lawyer, officially identify the body as Pitezel's. Once the insurance company paid out the $10,000 claim, Pitezel would emerge from hiding, and the two men would split the profits. For Pitezel, it seemed like a foolproof plan to finally achieve financial security for his family. He trusted Holmes implicitly to manage the grim logistics of the fraud. In early September of 1894, the plan was set in motion. Benjamin Pitezel traveled to Philadelphia and rented a property at 1316 Callowhill Street, establishing himself as the inventor B.F. Perry. He wrote to his wife, Carrie, telling her he was working on a new venture. The stage was set for the fake death. Holmes, however, had no intention of following the plan. The cost and risk of obtaining and transporting a substitute cadaver were an inconvenience he had decided to eliminate. For a man like Holmes, a far simpler solution was at hand. He traveled to Philadelphia and met Pitezel at the rented house. What happened next is known only from Holmes's later, often contradictory confessions. The most credible account is that he rendered Pitezel unconscious with chloroform, likely under the pretense of demonstrating a part of the act for faking his death. While Pitezel was helpless, Holmes murdered him. To obscure the cause of death and match the planned narrative of a lab accident, he doused Pitezel's body with benzene and set it on fire. The loyal partner, who believed he was part of a clever scam, had become the scheme's central, unwilling prop. His trust had been repaid with the ultimate betrayal. With Benjamin Pitezel dead, Holmes executed the rest of the plan with chilling precision. He brought in a local lawyer, Jephthah Howe, to the morgue. Howe, who had met Pitezel briefly, was unable to make a positive identification of the badly disfigured corpse. It was Holmes, the trusted friend, who tearfully identified the body as his dear associate, Benjamin Pitezel. The coroner ruled the death an accident. With the fraudulent identification secured, Holmes collected the $10,000 insurance payout. He gave Pitezel's widow, Carrie, only $500 of the money. He then began to spin an elaborate and cruel web of deceit. He told the grieving Mrs. Pitezel that her husband was not dead, but was alive and well, hiding out in London to avoid creditors. He explained that the body had been a substitute, just as planned, but that legal complications required Benjamin to remain in hiding. To make the story believable, he convinced Carrie to entrust 3 of her 5 children, 15-year-old Alice, 13-year-old Nellie, and 8-year-old Howard, into his personal care, promising he would reunite them with their father. The distraught and trusting widow agreed, handing her children over to the very man who had murdered their father. For Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitezel, a nightmarish journey began. Under the care of H. Holmes, they were effectively his prisoners, pawns in his ongoing deception. He shuttled them across the country, from city to city, throughout the American Midwest, and eventually into Canada. Their travels were a bewildering odyssey of cheap hotels and rented houses. All the while, Holmes maintained a cruel correspondence with their mother, Carrie Pitezel, who he was also moving from place to place separately. He would relay fabricated messages from her husband and have the children write letters home, carefully dictating their contents. He told Carrie that Benjamin missed the children terribly and wanted to see them, but that it wasn't yet safe. The children, isolated and confused, were told their father was just a city or 2 ahead of them and that they would see him soon. They had no reason to doubt the charismatic Dr. Holmes, their father's close friend. They were unaware that their journey was not toward a reunion, but was a convoluted path designed to confuse any trail, leading them further and further away from safety and deeper into the clutches of their captor. As the weeks turned into months, Carrie Pitezel's hope began to curdle in suspicion and fear. Holmes's excuses for why she could not see or speak to her husband grew increasingly elaborate and flimsy. Her letters from her children became sporadic and strange. A gnawing sense of dread took hold. Simultaneously, the Fidelity Mutual Life Association had its own suspicions about the Pitezel claim. They hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, one of the nation's premier private investigation firms, to look into the matter. The case was assigned to Detective Frank Geyer. Geyer began his work by investigating the insurance fraud, a task that quickly led to Holmes's arrest on a federal warrant for conspiracy in Boston. But when authorities began to question Holmes about the whereabouts of the Pitezel children, he was evasive and contradictory. With Holmes in custody but the children still missing, Detective Geyer's mission transformed. His new task was not just to uncover fraud, but to embark on a desperate quest to trace the ghostly trail of Holmes and the 3 missing children and find out what had become of them. Detective Frank Geyer's investigation was a masterclass in methodical police work. Starting from where the children were last seen, he began to patiently follow the cold, convoluted trail left by H. Holmes.
He traveled from city to city, meticulously checking hotel registers, rental agreements, and railway records, often showing photographs of the children to anyone who might have seen them. The search led him through Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Detroit. In Detroit, he found a crucial lead. A witness recalled Holmes traveling with the two girls, Alice and Nellie, renting a house in the city before taking a trip to Toronto, Canada. Geyer followed the trail north. In Toronto, his painstaking work paid off. He located a house at 16 St. Vincent Lane that Holmes had rented under an alias. When local police assisted Geyer in searching the property, he insisted they excavate the cellar floor. There, buried in a shallow grave, they made a grim and heartbreaking discovery: the bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel. The girls had been gassed to death, their bodies crammed together inside a large trunk and buried in the earthen floor. The search for two of the children was over.
Even with the horrific discovery in Toronto, Detective Geyer's work was not finished. Young Howard Pitezel was still missing. Geyer retraced Holmes's steps, knowing the boy had been separated from his sisters at some point during their journey. His investigation led him back to Indiana, specifically to the small town of Irvington, just outside Indianapolis. There, he located another cottage that Holmes had rented. The house was empty, but Geyer conducted a thorough search of the property. Inside the home, his attention was drawn to a large stove in the kitchen. He had the chimney and stovepipe dismantled piece by piece. Inside the flue, amid the soot and ash, he found what he was looking for. There were small fragments of bone, a piece of a jaw, and a full set of teeth, later identified by a dentist as belonging to 8-year-old Howard. Holmes had dismembered the boy, burned his remains in the stove, and left the evidence hidden in the chimney. The last piece of the tragic puzzle had been found. All 3 of the children entrusted to H. Holmes had been murdered. With the discovery of the children's bodies, the case against H. Holmes was sealed. He was already in custody in Philadelphia for insurance fraud, but now he was charged with the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. The evidence amassed by Detective Geyer and others was overwhelming. Faced with incontrovertible proof of his crimes, Holmes began to talk. Over the next several months, he gave a series of dramatic and conflicting confessions. He lied, he exaggerated, and he manipulated the press, at one point claiming he was possessed by Satan. He sold his story to the Hearst Corporation, crafting a sensationalist narrative that mixed kernels of truth with outlandish falsehoods. In his confessions, he admitted to killing Benjamin Pitezel and the 3 children, along with many others, though the final, verifiable number of his victims remains a subject of debate. His charm had finally dissolved, revealing the remorseless and narcissistic monster who had hidden in plain sight for so long. The nation was captivated and horrified by the story of the fiendish doctor from Chicago. The trial of H. Holmes for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel took place in Philadelphia in the fall of 1895. It was one of the most sensational trials of the century. Despite a bizarre and erratic defense that he conducted himself, the jury needed little time to deliberate. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On May 7, 1896, Herman Webster Mudgett, alias H. Holmes, was executed by hanging at Moyamensing Prison. His reign of terror was over, but the lives he destroyed could not be mended. Carrie Pitezel, having lost her husband and 3 of her children, was left to raise her 2 surviving children in the shadow of an unimaginable tragedy. The Pitezel family, drawn in by misplaced trust and the promise of easy money, had paid the ultimate price for their association with one of America's first and most prolific serial killers. Their story serves as a somber testament to the profound darkness that can hide behind a charismatic smile. Thank you for spending this time with us. Reflecting on these past events is a way of remembering the individuals involved and the impact their stories had on their communities. If you have any thoughts on today's case, we invite you to share them respectfully in the comments below. We hope you will join us again for our next true crime case.